The Sleeping Beauty, Level 4, Chapter 1. The Little Princess and the Six Fairies. There was a king and a queen who had been married for a long time, but they had no children. However, one day they finally gave birth to a little daughter. This day was an important celebration day in the kingdom. When the time came for the princess's baptism, a feast was prepared. The king and queen asked 6 fairies to be the princess's godmothers. The queen forgot to invite a 7th fairy. It was too bad, because this fairy was the most powerful of them all. She was also very evil and hateful. Chapter 2. The 7th Fairy. On the day the princess's baptism, the 6 good fairies came in chariots pulled by birds. They were welcomed by the king and queen, and after talking, the king and queen led them to the hall. A feast was prepared. Everything there was very impressive. There were delicious fruits, meats, bread, and many wonderful things there. The dishes were made of gold, and each fairy received a goblet. Each goblet was made from a single stone. One goblet was made of diamond, one of sapphire, one of ruby, one of emerald, one of amethyst, and one of topaz. The fairies were very pleased with the beauty of everything. Even in their fairy palaces, they didn't have such lovely goblets. They were about to take their places, but there was a loud noise outside. The queen looked out of the window and almost fainted. The bad fairy had arrived. The bad fairy was not invited to the feast. The queen guessed that this fairy came to do something terrible. Her chariot was black, and 4 dragons pulled it with fiery eyes and golden bodies. The fairy quickly got out of her chariot and walked into the hall with her staff in her hand. "How can it be? How can it be?" she cried to the queen. "Here, all my sisters have been invited to come, and only I have been forgotten." The queen did not know how to answer her. The queen was fearful. However, the queen didn't show her fear, and she made the 7th fairy feel welcome like the other fairies. The 7th fairy sat on the right side of the king, and the king and queen acted like they expected her to come. However, there was no special goblet for her. When she saw the other goblets that were given to the 6 fairies, her face was full of envy. She had fire in her eyes. She ate and drank, but she never spoke. Chapter 3. The Gifts from the Fairies. After the feast, the little princess was brought into the room. She smiled so sweetly and looked so pure that only a bad heart could have planned something terrible for her. The first fairy took the child in her arms and said, "My gift to the princess shall be happiness, because happiness is better than gold." Gold is good, said the second fairy, so I will give her the gift of wealth. She shall be healthy, said the third, because wealth is nothing without health. And I, said the fourth, will give her the gift of beauty to touch everyone's hearts, and humor to tickle everyone's ears, said the fifth. That is my gift to her. The sixth fairy hesitated. At that moment in time, the evil one came forward. While the others were talking, she was getting very angry. And I say, she cried, that when she turns 17, she shall prick her finger on a spindle and die. When the queen heard this, she cried out loud, and the king's face turned pale. But the sixth fairy came forward. Wait a moment, she said. I have not spoken yet. I cannot cancel what our sister did, but I say that the princess will not really die. She will fall into a deep sleep for 100 years, and everyone shall sleep with her. At that time, she will receive a special kiss, and she will wake up. When the wicked fairy heard this, she was furious, but the sixth fairy had already spoken. The wicked fairy couldn't do anything else. She ran out of the castle and jumped into her chariot. The dragons took her somewhere far away. Nobody knows where she went. The other fairies also went away, and they were sad because they knew what would happen to the princess. The king commanded that every spinning wheel and spindle be removed from the land. When this was done, the king felt very happy again. If all the spindles were gone, the princess could not prick her finger. If she did not prick her finger, she would not fall into a magical sleep. So the king and queen were satisfied, and everything was fine in the castle for 17 years. Everything that the fairies promised came true. The princess was so beautiful that everyone who saw her was surprised. She was so funny and kind that everyone loved her. She had health, wealth, happiness, and she smiled and was happy all the time. Chapter 4. The Sleeping Princess. One day, the king and queen went on a journey. The princess decided to climb up into a high tower. She had never been there before. She waited to see her parents come back home. She found the stairs that led to the tower, and she climbed them. She climbed them up and up and up until she was high above the castle rooftops. Finally, she came to the very top of the tower, and she found an iron door with an old key on it. The princess turned the key, and the door was open. Behind the door, she saw a room. Inside the room, an old woman sat at a spinning wheel. The princess had never seen a spinning wheel before. It was very interesting to her. She entered the room and came close to the old woman. She wanted to see it better. "What are you doing?" she asked. "I am spinning," answered the old woman. "And what is that little thing that moves around so fast?" "That is a spindle. It is very interesting, said the princess, and she stretched out her hand to touch it. The spindle pricked her finger. The princess sighed. Her eyes closed, and she fell back onto a sofa and into a deep sleep. A silence also quickly came down on everyone in the castle. The king and queen had just come home from their journey. They came down from their horses, entered the castle, and just then they fell asleep. The advisors who followed them into the castle also fell asleep. The dogs and horses in the garden slept, and the birds on the roof slept too. The boy who took care of the fire in the kitchen slept. The cook was not mad at the boy because she was asleep too. The food was not burned by the fire because the fire was also sleeping. Even the bugs in the castle and the bees among the flowers stopped moving. Everyone and everything slept. Then a magic forest quickly grew all around the castle and encircled it like a wall. The forest grew so thick and tall that not even a tower in the castle could be seen. Even though the princess slept, she was not forgotten. Many brave princes and heroes came and tried to cut through the forest to save her. But the tree branches were as hard as iron, and they grew back as fast as they were cut down. The branches were so twisted that no one could open them. Years passed by. The brave heroes who had tried to save the princess grew old and had children. Their children also grew up and got married. At last, everyone forgot about the princess, or she was remembered only as an old story. Chapter 5, 100 Years Later. After 100 years, a young and handsome prince came by the castle. He had been hunting, and he had ridden so fast that he had left his hunting helpers behind. Now he was hot and tired, and seeing a hut, he stopped to ask for a drink of water. The man who lived in the hut was very old. He brought the water the prince asked for. After the prince had a drink of water, he sat for a while and looked around. "What is that darkness, like a cloud, that I see over there?" he asked. "I cannot tell you exactly," said the old man, "because it is far away and I have never been there. My grandfather once told me that it was a magic forest. He said there was a secret castle deep in the middle of it, and that a princess was asleep inside it." "And how long has she been asleep?" asked the prince. His heart was beating very fast. "I cannot say," answered the old man, "but a long, long time. My grandfather was an old man when he told me. He could not even remember her." The prince thanked the old man for what he had told him. Then he rode away toward the magic forest. He went very quickly because he was in a hurry. Chapter 6. The Princess Wakes Up. When the prince was far from the forest looked like a dark cloud. But when he got closer, the flowers began to grow. The tree branches began to grow as well. When the prince came closer to the branches, the flowers were budding everywhere. When the prince came to the front of the forest, the branches opened up and there was a road in front of him. Along this road, the prince rode, and soon he came to the palace. He entered the garden and looked around. He was amazed. The dogs were sleeping on the ground, and they never woke up when the prince came close. The horses stood like statues. The gatekeepers slept leaning on their weapons. The prince stepped down from his horse and went into the palace. He looked in one room after another, and no one woke up to stop him. Finally, he came to the stairs that led to the tower. He climbed them, up and up, just like the princess had done many years before him. He came to the tower room, and then he stopped and stood amazed. There was a young woman on a couch. She was more beautiful than the prince had ever imagined. He could hardly believe there was such beauty in the world. He looked and looked, and then he bent over and kissed her. At the same time, there were sounds all through the castle of everyone waking up. The king and queen in their room stretched and rubbed their eyes. The gatekeepers woke up from sleep. The horses stamped and the dogs jumped up, barking. The meat in the kitchen was burning, and the cook was mad at the boy. The advisors smiled and bowed. Up in the tower, the princess opened her eyes. After she saw the prince, she loved him. The prince took her hand and lifted her from the couch. "Will you be my beloved wife?" he asked, and the princess answered yes. And so the prince and princess were married. There was a grand celebration. The 6 fairies came to the wedding and brought gifts. The gifts were the most beautiful gifts in the world. The 7th fairy was extremely angry. She was so angry that she could not live any longer, and then she died. But the prince and princess lived happily ever after.